Thank you very much, Jean.
Thank you very much. And I want to express to Marty again our huge thanks for coming, because he's given us the inspirational background for a lot of the things that we actually do in the way of treatments. And my aspect of this is going to be a little bit of things that may have been mentioned before in one or two other seminars we've had, but in fact it is to bring together the fact that allergies, as are recognized by some immunologists, are not the only ways in which people are affected by chemicals and by EMF. So here we go for how this is all demonstrated in some of the patients that we see. Just to emphasize that one man's meat is another man's poison. This was from Lucretius. And that food choices have been narrowed over centuries to those plants and animals which were not found to be toxic to our ancestors. And yet within these food ranges, there are lots of variations that occur, and the recognition of the causes of these variations in responses to foods has been systematized to a certain extent, in that we now know that different ethnic groups have different problems. Favisms due to glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase deficiency, and it's a Mediterranean disease in which people's cells disintegrate. Celiac disease, which has just been mentioned by UG Foods, is hypersensitivity to gluten, which is said to be an allergy to wheat, rye, barley, and oats. But the recognition of allergy and low-dose immunotherapy, reactions to abnormal reactions to foods, has been debated, and its definition is controversial. But the actual hypersensitivity term was coined in 1894. When Emil von Behring described an exaggerated response of guinea pigs to repeated doses of diphtheria toxin. And then Charles Richet described anaphylaxis in 1901-2. And then Clemens von Perke defined allergy as altered reactivity back in 1906. All of this is well over a century ago. And subsequently, Henry Dale, who got the Nobel Prize for something different, his work on the chemical transmission of nerve impulses, he showed that allergic diseases were due partly to the effect of histamine and antibodies, and that was in 1911. So then in Noon in 1911 published hay fever desensitization, and John Friedman employed allergen-specific immunotherapy, in which they used increasing doses of allergen to force the body to accept challenges, this desensitization. And that was vaccination against hay fever in 1914. We don't use this type of desensitization. It's too risky because people having big doses of things to challenge them can have anaphylaxis and collapse, which is what was being described earlier. But they do use it for grasses and wasp and bee venoms. But the type of testing and treatment that we use is called low-dose immunotherapy, but it's the way in which it is worked out is that it's a series of different dilutions, and we test people either sublingually or by skin testing, and provide them with treatment vaccines to which they don't have any symptoms. And these vaccines stabilize the responses of the body when exposed to provoking foods. And they have no deleterious effects on the patient. And it's been used on approximately 20 million people worldwide without serious adverse effects. So they're safe and they work. And we want to show that they actually do this by addressing calcium channels, which is what we've been told about by Dr. Paul, Professor Paul. We use about 360 standard allergen vaccines at Breakspear, and we have this manufactured without any preservatives in our facility here. It's approved by the Medicine Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, and we have a special license for it. And we also supply other hospitals in the UK, and we've supplied Dr. Eberhard Schwarz's hospital in Germany for probably nearly 20 years. And we've used this type of immunotherapy since 1980. But when it was originally published, it was published from first this type of vaccine was used in a study at the Middlesex Hospital by Professor Brostoff and Dr. Glynis Scadding in 1986, when they did do desensitization with sublingual therapy using our vaccines for people with allergic rhinitis. So we know that it's possible to do this even for the standard allergies. So 10 years ago, there was a paper by Lash showing that allergen-specific immunotherapy, which involves using repeated doses of the allergen, and it is disease-modifying. It's not just palliative. It's not like an antihistamine, meaning that you've got to take an antihistamine again the next time you encounter something, but it actually modifies the disease. And it prevents the onset of new sensitizations, and the quality of life of people is improved. And they've shown that low-dose immunotherapy can actually reverse allergies. It's the only, according to the WHO, immunotherapy is the only type of treatment that actually reverses allergies. Drugs will provide symptomatic relief, but this is the only therapeutic modality which has the potential to modify the natural course of disease. And there are a lot of studies which have shown this. I thought I would just illustrate my own experience, because I started work on migraine in the National Hospital for Nervous Diseases many years ago, and I was determined to prove that food allergy was a cause largely of migraine. And to obtain information, we thought that we would do a RAST test, which is called a radioallergosorbent test. And this is a test in which they are only looking at IgE antibodies. But then I thought, that's not going to be enough. We have to do elimination diets and then reintroduce foods by doing food challenges. And then I also did intradermal skin testing and the neutralization whilst at the National Hospital in Queen Square. And the method I used was that which was introduced by Lee and Miller, using serial dilutions in a 1:5 ratio in a diluent. And you can see that the dilutions are very dramatically reducing in strength. And you can see with a concentrate solution, which is a number 1, it's a 5 times dilution, and then you're altering the final concentrations dramatically to parts per million. And so I looked at a lot of patients, 286 patients, and then looked at what was showing in their tests. Those who showed any indication of those items that I mentioned were comprising 219. But you'll see that the RAS test itself didn't actually show very much. It was positive for 38 of these patients, but the diets only showed one proportion. The desensitization showed the largest proportion of them, but I wasn't able to do the desensitizing programs for all of the patients. So it's a little bit skewed, but just to show a little bit that grains can be a major component. Then dairy products, you can see in this pie chart depictions of all the indications again, and milk. So these are common foods: wheat, egg, cheese, tomato, rice, fish, tea, apple and orange, and maize and oats. You can see that the numbers dwindle here because out of the sample size of 286, only 54 showed that for any indication. So what it means is that in that very large group of people that I looked at the National, we were trying to identify which foods could be playing a part. And there were a lot of common foods involved. So unfortunately, my waiting list grew longer and longer whilst I was at the National, because I was only there for 2 sessions, then I was there for 4 sessions a week. And when I had a waiting list which was 21 months ahead, I gave up because it was quite impossible for me to look after patients with any degree of continuity. And so I left the National and did my own practice, because it was not possible to give a service to these people who were waiting 21 months for an appointment. And so I did my own dilutions and started a little practice. And so we used the dilutions that I was talking about. Initially, I used them in a preservative of 0.4% phenol because they weren't very keen on me having anything unpreserved while I was at the National. But then I thought many people were reacting to the phenol, and so I prepared them in saline with no preservatives and froze the vaccine so that we then have a procedure by which there's not a contaminant of a preservative. And then serendipity played a part, because what I found was that I had them frozen, these tubes, and there was a patient at the National who was combat troop, should I put it like that. He was very fit and active and so on, but he had terrible migraine. And when I took these tubes in, they were all frozen, and I said, well, just hold the tube for me and thaw them so that I can do the skin test or the sublingual test. This chap held the number 1 tube or the number 2 tube, and he collapsed. And here was this enormous man lying on the floor in my clinic at the National. I thought, oh my goodness, I've caused somebody to have anaphylaxis by touching the outside of a tube. How can this be? Nothing has got into him. So I thought, I recovered him by sitting him in a side room and gave him something to drink and so on and so on, look after him, and he was okay. So nothing happened to him, thank goodness, long term. And what I found was something must be getting through the tubes to be having an effect. So I sent my tube, which had been the container to the National Physical Laboratory. And they said, well, what gets through this tube is radio frequencies. So then I thought, what'll I do? Because I've got to prove something about these tubes. What does it mean? So in my clinic there, I didn't have anything very sort of sophisticated. So between the tube and my patient, whom I got to come back the next week, I put a solid plate. Actually, it was only just a metal plate I just picked up, put it in between, and then a mesh, which was a tea strainer. I tell you, it wasn't very sophisticated. So when I had a wide mesh tea strainer, the frequencies got through. When I had a solid plate, the frequencies didn't get through, and he was able to put his hand near the plate and not have any effects. Very brave man. So there was an interactive effect with an electromagnetic one penetrating through a mesh but screened by solid metal plates. So then I thought, well, I've got to look into this a bit more. And a chap called Secretary said that migraine is an endorphin withdrawal syndrome. And I then found that somebody working on endorphins was Dr. Cyril Smith at Salford University. And he had been working on endorphin effects in rabbits or mice or something. And so I contacted him, said, look, I'm interested in this because my migraine sufferers are affected by frequencies. And he said, oh, how interesting, because he's an electrical engineer. And he came along and said, well, we'll put patients in a Faraday cage and we'll have a frequency generator and we'll see if frequencies from the other side of the room can affect your patient. So I said, okay, we'll ask some patients if they're prepared to participate in this, and they did. So we had a Faraday cage, which was screened from outside influences, and inside this cage sat a very brave patient, well away from me. I was 6 feet away, and we had a frequency generator, and we tweaked this, producing very weak electromagnetic fields between 1 hertz and 2 gigahertz. And we went all through different frequency generators producing these fields. And what we found was the patients reacted with their symptoms. So we had a few patients and we put them in this Faraday cage. They would say, oh, this is my wheat symptom, or this is my symptom that I get when I smell perfume. And they were at different frequencies along this whole frequency spectrum. So all this rather crude work that we were doing, which was just showing that humans are very sensitive to electromagnetic frequencies all through this range. So then we did a thing on biological effects of neutralizing vaccines. When we did these dilutions, we found that if we continued the dilutions down below that range I told you of at the beginning, where we had those pyramids of weak dilutions, if we go below Avogadro's number, at which number it's thought that there is no more of the impulse from the original substance in it, we were still getting cyclical changes in these patients. So then I thought, well, I can't leave this. I've got to find out about homeopathy. And homeopathic dilutions we got from one of the homeopathic pharmacies in London. We'd selected 15 patients who had previously been diagnosed as being allergic to wheat, milk and egg, both by elimination diet followed by challenges which induced symptoms, and had observable physiological changes by previous skin testing using the provocation neutralization method. And we also had these vaccines prepared by Ainsworth Homeopathic Pharmacy in dilutions of 1x, 6x, 10x, and 30x. And so what we found was these patients had different exposures to these different dilutions, and they had symptoms, different patients depicted thus, or with the triangles, or with the crosses, and so on. And they would have their symptoms on a scale of 1 to 10 at different dilutions of the homeopathic preparation. So what it means is homeopathy can have effects, but it also can have adverse effects. You have to have the right dilution to turn the reaction off. There was symptoms to milk at different dilutions. And, sorry, I beg your pardon, we showed it for all those 15 patients. All the names are along the side. So then this is a part of a reasoning process that has gone on over time. And we know that man's sense of awareness, therefore, can be impacted by a lot of different mechanisms. The neural control of contact sensitivity and the neural pathway of allergies we have to consider. And just from an old paper, they found that airway sensory nervous system receptors are present. Most active will be the C fiber receptors. C fiber receptors mediate the axon reflex neurogenic inflammation and bronchoconstriction and mucus secretion. And if you have mucosal hyperemia, this can cause neuropeptide release, and activation of the receptors will cause cerebral nervous system reflexes. And my colleagues here from the Autonomic Nervous System Department will know all about that. So they found that Shepherd and Mayan, Professor Mayan, gave a paper here a few weeks ago from Manchester, has shown that the depletion of neuropeptides in the skin was previously shown to abolish this antigen-induced contact sensitivity in mice. He was treating mice ears with some of this substance, dinitrochlorobenzene, and that would produce a contact sensitivity response. But when the nerves had been damaged, the contact sensitivity didn't occur. So the reaction is definitely mediated by the nerves. And then he also, they did some various other tests and showed that the substance that was involved is called neuropeptide substance P, and the size of the contact sensitivity response was restored by substance P. So in fact, what he was saying in these papers is that there is a chemical and a neural basis for contact sensitivity. But my experience here was showing that we can invoke neural responses in our patients by electrical and homeopathic preparations as well as the real antigen. So they found that their data indicates the presence of immunological and neural mechanisms. So here we have a small depiction of the neural pathway. Dendritic cells are present in the surfaces of the body, and every fourth cell is attached to a dendritic cell, and this sends information along C fibers to the autonomic nervous system ganglia, to the spinal cord, then to the hypothalamus and cortex. It's sort of that's the route to the brain. And then there's a feedback control, and it may be at lots of different points along here that there is a feedback control. That's probably something we're going to have to ask Dr. Julu to explain to us. But these are the local responses. Dendritic cells, they mature in the lymph nodes, and they can make what are called angry macrophages, which leads to cell-mediated immunity, or B lymphocytes, which are a different type of lymphocyte, and they make antibodies. So we've got both cell-mediated immunity and antibody immunity as triggered through the neural pathway. So it's unmyelinated axons, which have voltage-gated sodium channels along the entire length of the membrane. And one knows about this because this substance, dimethyl sulfoxide, will block conduction along these nerves, and this is a solvent with local anesthetic properties. But we also had another person who came to us from Manchester, and he produced a piece of equipment called Sedita, which is cell demodulated electronically targeted analgesia. And this is a piece of equipment where he was producing two waves which interacted with each other. There was a sort of base wave and another one, and where they crossed over, he could induce analgesia. It was cell demodulated and electronically targeted. And this analgesia was so powerful with his equipment, which was directed, say, in two directions against, say, a tooth root. Somebody could have this directed at a tooth, and they could have the tooth drilled without feeling any pain at all. It was used in the spinal cord for epidural anesthesia in people who have operations, or in childbirth, completely safely, because they were only doing two little crossovers of frequencies. So targeting is used with two high-frequency fields, which were in the radio frequency range. Now, we will be told by Martin Paul that these would have been affecting us, but they're sent through the body and they're picked up by a common receiver. And beneath that receiver, an area in which two high-frequency waves mix, there was a complex modulated wave forming a sort of envelope of low-frequency nature. And he could block pain going along the pathways. So the neural pathways can be interrupted. So the C fibers, the autonomic nervous system, ganglia, spinal cord, hypothalamus, and cortex, at different points, when information goes to along the C fibers, you can have a local return of information. It doesn't have to go all the way to the cortex and back again. At least I think the feedback control might be at different points, but certainly you can get hay fever and pain and heart rate changes, asthma, emotional things, brain fog or migraine through these pathways. So my point is that we were demonstrating that with frequencies you can get these so-called allergic responses in different ways. And there was an absolute concordance between our neutralizing vaccines, electromagnetic fields, and homeopathy. And each one of these was impinging on recognition systems in the body, which have this final common pathway which can produce identical symptoms, because we could nullify the symptoms. And the response of these influences cannot be a cumbersome immunological response with antibodies and so on being engendered, because the responses were very swift, so it wasn't something that took time. So it has to lie in the chemical sphere with delicate mechanisms, endorphin system, cytokines, or the recognition system for electromagnetic field frequencies. And I've put as yet unidentified, but I think Professor Paul has identified the site. So just to mention to you what the mechanisms are and how, as has been highlighted, the standard concept of allergy is that it's mediated by one group of antibodies called IgE antibodies. But IgE isn't just mediated through, allergy isn't just mediated through IgE. In our experience at Breakspear, one of the major mechanisms is that the autonomic nervous system becomes triggered. And we supplied to the House of Lords Science and Technology Select Committee back in 2007, 9 years ago, evidence about this. And Dr. Julu showed that where the autonomic nervous system response is abnormal, it can return to normality after a week's treatment with immunotherapy. And he's been doing the tests for our patients and illustrating the autonomic nervous system is the neural pathway for allergy. And he's shown that in any particular patient, we will have this particular patient had a blood pressure recording here, 160, and when they were asked to hold their breath and blow against a closed glottis, this empties the chest of blood, and it should have an auto-transfusion effect where the blood comes back into the body, into the chest, by force from the effects of what goes on in the abdomen by the spleen and the liver and the kidneys squeezing blood back. And it should reach here, otherwise the person can collapse. And here you are, the patient did collapse because this auto-transfusion failed. This was the response of the individual before they had had any of our low-dose immunotherapy. But 1 week afterwards, guess what? This was perfectly normal. After the Valsalva maneuver, they easily reached the target and even overshot it. So it was possible to correct this abnormal function within a week's treatment. And here's another one where this particular person was, this was the diastolic blood pressure and the heart rate being measured. And when somebody does any exercise, such as holding something tightly, the blood has to go to that limb. And therefore, there must be a certain amount of vasoconstriction, and the heart rate should go up and the blood pressure should go up in order to get more blood into that limb. And this failed in this particular person. And 1 week after having her comprehensive low-dose immunotherapy, both of these reached the target perfectly well. So there was a jolly good correction of what had gone wrong in this individual. So the second mechanism is the cellular mechanism, and patients sensitive to foods and chemicals can have their cells looked at under a microscope, and the cells are visualized using a fluorescent probe. And once a reaction occurs at the cell's surface, calcium flows into the cell, and the disruption occurs with foods and chemicals that the person is sensitive to. This is a standard method of cell biology, and it's been used by Dr. John McLaren Howard in his laboratory. And he does a test called the lymphocyte sensitivity test. And in this, he will test patients' blood to foods and chemicals. He'll look at their cells under a microscope, and then the lymphocytes are looked at by a process called confocal microscopy, so he can see through the depth of the cell. And there's a fluorescent probe put in. The substances can be applied to the slides, and if the lymphocytes are sensitive to it, then they will react. And once a reaction occurs at the cell surface, calcium gets into the cell. So how do we see the calcium? The calcium, there's a calcium probe which goes blue if the cell is breached, cell wall is breached. And when the person's cells are viewed initially, the amount of calcium in the cell can be calculated by the density that's shown in the fluorescent probe. So if you then add different agents to the slides, to different slides obviously, if the lymphocyte is sensitive, then it will allow the ingress of calcium. And so the test is used to identify intracellular calcium status and the reaction of the cells to a panel of chemicals, and some of these are in foods. For example, a panel of substances that we check include these. We've got a whole panel of about 50 different things that can be checked, but we standardly use nickel. Nickel is present in a lot of different foods. Unfortunately, it's in chocolate and soya. Salicylates are in perhaps 100 different plant foods. Sodium benzoate, although it's a preservative that they use in commercial foods, it's also produced in the gut by bacterial action on food residues. And so we've got a lot of different things that we can use to check what people are sensitive to. And we do a standard program of 12 items so that we represent foods and chemicals. And here is a cell of a patient before being exposed to sulfite. Now, sulfite is from metabisulfite, which is used as a preservative in wine, white wine, but it's also used as a preservative in bagged salads. And this one, the calcium is present. It would show as a blue color were it to be in the cell. This is before exposure to sulfite in a person who is known to be sulfite sensitive. And here is the cell after exposure to sulfite with considerable calcium ingress shown by the blue probe. And when we have treated such a person and do the test again, it looks just like that, as though the calcium has not got into the cell at all. So we know that we can stabilize the calcium influx into cells by using a low-dose immunotherapy treatment. Here is somebody who's sensitive to formaldehyde. And on exposure to formaldehyde, there's the blue calcium getting in. So what we did was to look at the lymphocyte sensitivity test before and after doing low-dose immunotherapy using this neutralizing technique where we've done a series of dilutions. And when the sensitized lymphocytes exposed to the allergen, we get the calcium rushing into the cells, and we quantify the intracellular calcium, and so we can measure the numbers. We've got a measurement. And this is what happened to a group of patients. We had a percentage decrease in intracellular calciums pertaining to the sensitivities after low-dose immunotherapy in every one of these, with a percentage decrease in the level of 25, 16, 24, 32, 18%, quite large percentages less. And the number of patients analysed are in their 40s, usually, for each of them. So what we know is that with low-dose immunotherapy, we can stabilise these calcium channels in the cell walls. Now, what I haven't said is that we are now in the process of looking at the way in which electromagnetic fields affect the lymphocyte sensitivity test. And we know that it is practically always an increase of the sensitivity that a person has to the actual substance. So this percentage decrease we've sent for publication, but we're just working out the ones which are to do with electrical hypersensitivity, and we hope to be able to submit that as well, because it has shown a similar dramatic decrease in calcium influx into the cells when people have low-dose immunotherapy. Now, the low-dose immunotherapy is not directly against the electromagnetic fields, but just as in my patient who collapsed when he held the tube, he is affected by a frequency that happened to have come to him through that tube. It was a very weak electromagnetic field interactive effect between him and the contents of that tube, but nevertheless he was affected by it to the effect that he collapsed. And so we know that frequencies are involved and they can be screened. Equally, we know that we have a tool here for helping people with electromagnetic hypersensitivities. And just as we know that in patients who've got food sensitivities, we have to say to them, well, you can have your low-dose immunotherapy vaccine, put it under the tongue and try and eat some of the food and see how you get on with it. And very often they can reintroduce the foods, but often they can do little bits at a time. Sometimes they can do more. We've had people who've come here who've been eating one food. Only one food can they tolerate, and others they couldn't tolerate at all. And what we've been able to do is to show that we can neutralize their reactions, eventually desensitizing them to these foods in order that they can tolerate them better. But in addition to that, we know that if we minimize their sensitivities to foods and encourage them to eat clean foods so that they're not contaminated by organophosphates, which adds another dimension perhaps to the problem, they will be better off. And if we say to them, as with my patient who said, that's my wheat reaction and that's my perfume reaction, people who've got sensitivities to one modality, foods, can be sensitive to chemicals. And so what we do is we say to them, minimize the problems, don't expose yourself to a huge lot of chemicals, try to minimize them so that you can lead as healthy as possible a life, and we will treat you to see that you regain your stability as far as the sensitivities are concerned. So low-dose immunotherapy can stabilize reactions. Allergy, altered reactivity, is not only from IgE antibodies. Anaphylaxis, where people collapse, is dysautonomia, causing shock. Triggers of allergens can provoke the autonomic nervous system. It's imperative that the autonomic nervous system be measured in people so that we know what's happening, just as it's imperative for us to know what's happening at a cellular level in cell biology. The cell responses with disruption of membrane channels occurs in sensitivity states. And hence we are able here to guide people from a state of ill health and heightened sensitivity to chemicals and to electrical hypersensitivity to regain some of their stability and to be able to be integrated, but without necessarily asking them to be imbued with all of the nasty things which can terrorize their cells. So what we want is a gradual reintroduction of things in as safe as possible a way in order that people can retain and regain their health. Thank you very much.
Kenneth Bruce, I found today... Sorry?
Who are you addressing?
I think it'll relate to Dr. Monro and Professor Paul.
Well done.
The combined effect is just staggering. I've learnt an awful lot today. I've had to learn from my own experience that I'm allergic to additives, preservatives and colouring, and you face a meal not knowing whether you've got 7.5 hours of serious convulsions before you put it right. But I can relate to what Professor Paul said. I had 8 parathyroids taken out when I was 22 years of age, because my doctor said I'd got excessive calcium, which was showing itself. That there were days when I had to crawl out to my car on my hands and knees, you know. I was treated by the best in the business, Trevor Cook at Birmingham General, who took out 8 parathyroids, and he said to me at the time, you've got 2 choices, have the operation or be dead in 6 months. So we move on then to 2000, worked brilliantly. I was checked every year, not a problem. The calcium came down, and since 2000 I've had this allergy, and I've had to work out for myself. My doctor will just say, "You got closes." I'm not sure how helpful that is, but as I say, I have to be very careful with gravy, any additives or preservatives in it. I think that's the main problem I have.
I don't want to break into your...
Well, I'm only saying today, been very helpful. Only that, you know, if I could find a cure and not be petrified. I have been here about 18 months ago to speak to Dr. Is it Schmeck? And I think I'm encouraged today to continue and see if we can, if we not find a cure, moderate the symptoms, because I never know when it's going to happen.
Right, thank you very much. Anybody else got a question?
Preventative approach to EMS in the world. For ordinary people with allergies, I've got teenagers that are constantly using their mobiles, etc.
Is this working too?
Yeah, I mean, obviously avoidance is the first thing you always have to do. The problem with EMFs is they come from so many different sources. And so I'm not sure, you know, how, and we could probably spend about 3 hours talking about this and still not exhaust, you know, everything. Because there are so many different sources of EMFs, but you know, you kind of start one at a time and try to reduce what you can with each of them. You know, obviously, if you have to use a cell phone, there are safer ways to do it. You don't carry them on your body. That's one of the things you don't do. But you also, you know, don't. You can use a headset. You can use them on speakerphone. That's better. But you know, but there are people who are so sensitive they can't tolerate anything like that. And I mean, the problem is, you know, we've got cell phone towers all over the place. We have Wi-Fi all over the place. We have, you know, I mean, and we're continuing to produce more and more of these devices of various sorts all the time. There are issues of what's called dirty electricity in our wiring that can be an issue. it goes on and on. I mean, so avoidance is always is critical. Whether you're sensitive to chemicals or you're sensitive to EMFs, but actually doing it in practice is a major challenge. Obviously there are things you can do, but it takes time. But then there are all the other questions of treatment that would improve things.
Perhaps I could answer this too. Many years ago, I was asked to go to a school for deaf children, and at the school, they said that it's absolutely dreadful. Since the summer holidays, the children have gone completely berserk and we can't cope. Now, this is a school where children are already handicapped, and it's a huge problem because there wasn't anywhere else for them to go. But they were disturbed and running around and not able to be controlled. And what had happened is there had been two things that had happened over the summer holidays. They'd put urea formaldehyde foam insulation into the walls of the school to insulate it, and it was outgassing still, so a lot of formaldehyde exposure. But also they'd introduced a new system for the children where they had headsets, and the frequencies that were being used into the headsets from the teacher who was teaching them is the same frequency as for formaldehyde. And what happened, according to Dr. Cyril Smith, and what happened is that these children were completely overwhelmed by chemical and electrical exposure, the imprints of which were similar, and they were it was impossible for them to survive properly. So I said, well, you have to outgas the place, have the windows open, have as much heating on to outgas it as possible. But what we did was we changed the diet of the children in the school. They all wrote down their diets on little pink exercise books, and some of the diets were appalling. They would come to school with having eaten a bun or something, or sometimes they would have had a sugary something or other. Their diets were bad. At school, some of them actually lived in houses with the house parents, and at the school the children were given a lunchtime meal, but they would have house parents they would go home to in the evening. And so what we had to do is we taught the children, we taught the house parents, we taught their own parents, we taught the teachers, we had to teach the school psychologist and the school meal service how to cater for these children, and we put them on clean food diets. They had proper food instead of, as they depicted, an orange squash bottle. And I made them write on this because they had to be taught not to do this. They were writing on the orange squash bottle all the additives in it, the azo dyes that would have been very disturbing to some. And then they had an orange juice bottle, and I said, what's in that? And they put OJ. So anyway, the whole point is that we had to do all this teaching of everybody in order to get it right. But by the end of the second term, that was the spring term, the children were fine as they had been before, even though they had still the same headsets and they still had presumably residual urea formaldehyde exposure, but the diet made a huge difference. So you can do it from different angles.
Just ask, I think maybe behind Kim's question there might have been the thought that is there anything in LDI, low-dose immunotherapy, that would help any of these situations for
Yes.
EMF, if you like?
Well, yes, because you're treating the foods and chemicals in the same way. So that is the actual modus operandi of this. We treat their sensitivities generally, and it reduces their heightened sensitivity to electrical fields.
So I think what Dr. Monro says is there is hope for people that suffer from these, and you can treat the diet, which has a beneficial effect overall, on the ability to cope with the EMFs. Is that fair, someone?
Yes.
Thank you.
Though you can't overcome massive exposure, people sometimes have to move if they're living under a high tension cable or something.
Sorry.
I think there is one connection that is missing here is that.
Can I just interrupt you a minute?
Yeah.
Dr. Peter Jeweler actually works within the Breakspear team, so he obviously is close to a lot of what we're talking about.
There's one connection that is missing here. I'm sorry for my voice, but usually the immune system, that's the reason why we do lymphocyte sensitivity. The immune system, if they are taught to fight, and the signal for them to start fighting is through calcium signaling. And that is the reason why when we do lymphocyte sensitivity tests, what we are actually doing is that we would have captured an enemy soldier, and we are trying to interrogate that soldier to find out what their mission to fight is, by showing them all these other things like salicylates and nickel and the rest of it to find out which one they would be fighting. Now, the missing connection with the electromagnetic field is that these soldiers who are already taught, they usually lie dormant. But one of the signals to make them start fighting is electromagnetic signaling. And that is what we also do during lymphocyte sensitivity tests, that you expose the lymphocyte. If it says nothing, then you introduce the electromagnetic wave as well. Most likely they will talk and tell you what they are fighting. See? So that is exactly the reason why some people, they will say, okay, I've become sensitive to electromagnetic wave, when actually it means that they were already sensitive to something, but there were very many soldiers who were lying low. They have not yet they were sleeping soldiers. So they were lying low waiting for that trigger moment to tell them to start fighting. And once the electromagnetic wave triggers them, then the whole immune system is mobilized, and then you start feeling terrible. And then you blame the electromagnetic waves when actually you had already been sensitized to something else before. Like a typical case is Jean's children case.
So what it means you have to do...
For the audience. Is this sort of testing available generally, Peter? Can your GP sort it out?
No. Not at all. But you see, this lymphocyte sensitivity test started because where would
people go if they wanted to have themselves or whether their family tested?
They have to come to Breakspear at the moment, because Breakspear is the only one, clinical thing that I've actually collaborated with the laboratory. But they still say that it is not for clinical it is still research. Up to now, it is only us who are here who have put our foot down and say we'll string up our own qualification and say it is for treatment.
Okay.
Well,
Yeah.
except...
Work in progress.
Well, except that I can say that when a test is done by a laboratory, the laboratory is a research laboratory, but once there has been a publication, in effect, that validates the test to some extent. So we're just awaiting that position.
We are trying to do that now, actually, the publication.
So you're waiting
Yeah,
for submission there.
Yeah, I've got two questions. The last question, I think, was answered, the lymphocyte sensitivity test. I'm electrosensitive myself. I've worked in electronic engineering and worked with high power microwaves at university, and that's where I think I got the problem. The other two questions I've got are, one is when I was doing my studies in microwaves, they talked about the skin depth effect of microwaves. They're very small, 1 or 2 millimeter sort of wavelength size, and they were saying that penetration into your body or anything is very difficult, doesn't have the energy and the depth to actually penetrate deep. So if we take that is the case, then is it that the skin is getting sensitive, and the calcium effects that you talk about is skin and then it somehow goes into the deeper organs, or is that a different effect?
I've heard these things. Obviously, I'm skeptical about them. One of the interesting studies that was done by a group in Switzerland, they found that when pregnant cattle were being grazed near cell phone towers, that many of the calves were born with cataracts. Now they're deeply in the body of the mother, and here they come out and they have cataract. I mean, so there's something wrong with this argument. I don't know what it is, but empirically it doesn't seem to make sense. It doesn't hold up.
Okay, thanks. The other question, at practical level, about food, is having too much calcium in your diet, is that an issue? You know, milk, cheese, and all these things, or will they most of that go through your system and it's not really?
It's a minor issue, not a major issue. I mean, in general, we regulate the calcium in the blood in ways that have been talked about here. And so, in general, the calcium in the diet doesn't have a large effect. It can have a small effect, but that's not the main thing we need to worry about.
And perhaps I can add to that, which is that if you just have in your mind's eye the skeleton, you'll see how much calcium there must be, because it's that which is depicted in X-rays. It's the third commonest mineral in the body, but we don't want it cluttering up cells. We want it in the right place. And so there's thousands of times more outside the cells than inside the cells.
I think the thing is that the level of calcium in the cytoplasm is maintained very low. It's about 10 to the minus 7th molar. And so there's something like a 10,000-fold concentration gradient, but there's also a big electrical gradient that drives it into the cell. So there's a gigantic force basically driving calcium in the cell, and we keep it out. So that tells you it's important to keep it out under most circumstances. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing all this stuff. So, but it's the regulation of that flux, both in and out, that's critical.
I have a technical questions for each of you. Dr. Monro, there are more and more chemicals being produced and thrown at us all the time. Our world is just becoming more and more polluted. How does your testing take account of that constant rolling out of more and more chemicals? And also, could you tell me how the testing that you do differs, if it does in any way, from cytotoxic testing?
Well, the testing that we do for our patients is personal to that patient. We test the individual with a tiny dilution of something to which they might be sensitive, and observe their reactions. And we also observe what happens to a skin wheel if we introduce it in that way. So we're able to tell what suits the individual. With regard to the thousands of chemicals, yes, I'm afraid we are a species that is busily polluting itself. The big problem is going to be, as has been said, we're not only going to be facing masses of pollutants from electromagnetic pollutants, but also from chemical pollutants. So it's important to try to clear things away from the body and to minimize the exposure to the chemicals that are noxious. So we're not talking about toxicology, which talks about poisons. Poisons are something which affects a person at the minutest dose and can be very toxic. But we're talking about pollutants which are said to be non-toxic, but which can accumulate in the body. And we can measure something like 168 common pollutants in one of the tests that we do, and then do a program to clear it out of the body. And we clear it out using the skin, the gut, the breath, and by diverting things from the body into the kidneys. And so we use these mechanisms for clearance.
Maybe if I could summarise there, some people who are so enthusiastic about cutting down the carbon dioxide we're generating might spend their time and their efforts trying to reduce all this pollution through EMF or through chemicals that's going on. Because that in the longer run, if what Professor Paul is saying will have effect on the genes, then that in the long term is probably more dangerous to the world population. Would you agree? The question over here.
Can
Oh,
I?
sorry,
Sorry, I just had one more question for Professor Paul. Can you explain to me, because I'm trying to just grasp the mechanism that you were describing, what actually draws calcium into the cells in the first place? I mean, I get that when the gates are open, they rush in, but what's actually attracting them into the cells?
Well, there, as I just said, there's this huge electrochemical gradient that drives calcium in. It's gigantic, okay? It's, and so there's 10,000 times, is just the concentration of calcium outside the cell is about 10,000 times higher than the concentration in the cytoplasm, okay? So that's not really difficult. It's not a difficult issue.
Yeah, no, I get
It's
that
easy
now.
to understand.
Yep.
But what's true is that calcium is an important regulatory molecule. So what we do is part of our normal physiology is we open these channels for a short time and let some calcium in, let it regulate something, and then we chuck it out. The problem with this is it's huge amounts, way above that.
Yeah, just to reinforce, because you asked a very important question. Calcium signaling is actually the life of the cell. And it also differentiates between excitatory cells and non-excitatory cells. So whether the cell is going to produce electrical impulses in order to do some other work, or whether that cell is going to be dumb and do nothing. And it is actually the one that keeps us alive, because it is the one that dictates when the heart should beat. You see, it is the one that actually dictates exactly when the heart should go pop and it beats, or it ignores other impulses and stay refractory. So calcium signaling is very, very important. And also, once it is released from outside, inside the cell, it is never roaming free. It is like a VIP with the entourages, like a prime minister going somewhere with all these cars and everything. So they are in packages, Tesco bags that have been wrapped around them. They don't go free into the cells. They are VIPs. They only go to do certain things only, and then they're out again. Just like Mr. Cameron will not come into central London and meet Boris Johnson without the entourages. He will just come, walk quickly, and go back to where he's supposed to be safe. That's how you should look at calcium. It's very, very important.
Hi. In relation to the neuropsychiatric effects of electromagnetic radiation, in relation to teen depression, how do you think sertraline, or probably Zoloft for you, do you think that counters the symptoms or masks them, or what's the relationship there with the calcium channels, and is there one?
I don't have the foggiest idea. I think maybe somebody else here might know more about this than I do. But I think there's some question about the psychoactive drugs and whether they're actually reversing the problems, or whether they are in some ways masking them. But again, somebody else probably, there may be someone else here who knows a lot more about this than I do.
Do you want to address it?
With sertraline. Just to say that we've been presented with some evidence that some of the active drugs are just masking things. A lot of them increase from tryptophan metabolism, and if you just use a natural agent like tryptophan, that can be degraded and eliminated by the body much more safely.
Calcium reuptake, the specific calcium reuptake inhibition passes through calcium because the vesicles of the neurotransmitters, the release and the reuptake is controlled by calcium signaling. That is at the pre-synaptic level.
Yeah.
Question for Professor Paul. We didn't get to your concluding slide, unfortunately. In your conclusions, one is to repeal the Telecommunications Act of 1990.
That's an American act. That was an American idiocy. But anyway, yeah.
Right. How realistic is it that that act could be changed? And in light of the US Navy study in 1971, would we have to wait another 45 years to get some change?
It is only realistic if there is a major outcry from a vast number of the public. If that does not happen, that will never happen. I don't know whether there's any realistic possibility of that, but my impression is that people are becoming more and more skeptical about the industry claims on this. And I think that's, and let me just give you a little story that happened about a day ago to me. When I flew into Heathrow Airport, and I'm going through the immigration, talking to the man there, and he asked me, "What am I doing here?" And I tell him I'm giving a talk here. And he said, "What's the talk about?" And I said, I'm talking about how electromagnetic fields impact the cells of our bodies. And he looks at me and he says, "I bet it's not good." And I said to him, "That's right, it's not good, but industry will tell you just the opposite." And he says to me, "Of course." So, I mean, I really do feel that people's views are starting to change on this. And many lay people, I think, are becoming more and more skeptical. So who knows what's possible? I can't say, really.
Professor Paul, I'm convinced by your argument on nitric oxides that is one of the effects I have. What tests can be carried out to prove that, in my case?
That nitric oxide? Well, you can, I mean, okay, so nitric oxide is unstable in the body, but what it gets converted into are nitrates and nitrites, which can be measured clinically. So if you're looking for a clinical test to see if you're reacting, for instance, to electromagnetic fields or to chemicals, probably, you could measure an increase in nitrates and nitrites. The only question is, what's the optimal time to do that? That is, how long after exposure would be the optimal time? And I haven't seen any data on that, but it should be something that should be, it's doable based on standard clinical tests.
And you can measure BH4. BH2, BH4.
Yeah, but that's a lot harder, right? Yeah.
We can do that.
Oh yeah. Okay. Good.
Breakspear,
Yes.
Breakspear can do that test.
Not the test on nitric oxide, but that we can do a test which is one step beyond that, which is to measure tetrahydrobiopterin, which is a product which comes from this reaction. You can say something about that, Marty, because it's your work.
I don't think I want to get into it, Jean.
No, has everybody said all they want to say? Yeah. Well, I think it just remains for me to thank our speakers. Thank you, Professor Paul. Thank you,
Thank you.
Dr.
Thank
Monro.
Mhm.
It's been very interesting. Can I just remind you, if you want the details of the petition, then do make sure you put your email address on the sheets at the back there. And then for me to thank two other people who've been here. Our friends from Healthy House, who you'll see their display at the back there. They are very helpful. And I think we got help from them in terms of sending out notification of this event via their emails. And I've heard one people say how surprised they were. I hope they were pleased as well. I certainly was, because I'm a supporter and a user of Healthy House products. And when I got the email, oh, that's clever. How do they know this is going on? But now I know the answer. Very good. Thank you, both of you.